Okay, we'll get started now. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first XRI Design Talk of 2026. And this is hosted by the UCLA XR Initiatives Design Subcommittee. Today, we're excited to welcome Francesca Albrezzi, who many of you already know as the co-chair of the UCLA XR Initiative. In addition, Francesca is the Manager and Digital Research Specialist for GIS and Visualization in UCLA's Office of Advanced Research Computing, where she supports faculty working at the intersection of humanities research and emerging technologies. We're thrilled to hear her insights today on volumetric video capture. And with that, I'll hand it over to Francesca.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Thank you all for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Uh-oh. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Lauren said, today we're diving into volumetric capture, or as I like to call it, video with a z-axis. And here's what I have for our time together today. I'll start with obviously some fundamentals so that, we're just a quick primer on what volumetric data actually is, comparing point clouds to texture meshes, and just to make sure that we're all speaking sort of the same technical language. I'll attempt to pull back the curtain a bit on the technical stack. It's obviously complex, but we'll look at some hardware arrays, the idea of needing to sync multiple sensors and the software pipeline that's required to turn raw depth data into playable 3D assets. Next, we'll look at the where and the how. I'll compare professional grade multi-camera studio setups to kind of the emerging world of mobile LiDAR and consumer depth sensors. This section is really about finding the right tool for your specific budget and environment, right? Obviously, there's a spectrum of things here to consider. And I've got a few examples of research in motion that I want to share, some case studies where we'll look at how peers are already using this to measure human movement and create social presence. And then I'll kind of finish with a reality capture or a reality check for us. We can't forget about the hurdles here. Volumetric data is notoriously heavy and often messy. And I want to make sure that we draw attention to massive file sizes and the ethical considerations of creating digital doubles. And finish with a discussion. I'm more of an enthusiast than an expert at this point. I'd say I'd love to hear how these tools might fit specifically to your current needs or interests, any upcoming projects that you might have. What are people looking for support for? And again, I should mention I'm giving this talk or a version of this talk again next week as part of an OARC workshop. So thank you in advance for being my guinea pigs. If you want more information on certain things, please let me know and I'll try to add it to that session since that session will be a little bit longer. And I'll mention at the end of this talk some of the additional things that'll be part of that workshop. And I'll share in the chat very quickly a link to that workshop in case you're interested in attending that. Let me quickly do that. All right. So before we dive in, I want to give a bit of context about how I come to this work. See, I have a secret backstory. My father just retired from being a professor at USC's Films of Cinematic Arts for about 30 years. So I naturally grew up with a strong interest in filmmaking. It all started when I won my elementary school's film festival with a Toy Story-esque stop-start animation short called When Humans Are Away. And that involved tool dolls having way too much fun. And I unfortunately didn't win for my Blair Witch Project spoof 2 years later, but I did take home a second trophy for my acting within my friend's project, Return of the Mutant Dog. So yes, it's continued in some fashion, my love of film and filmmaking ever since then. And yes, this presentation will come with props, so you have been warned. But I did several production programs at USC, and I've learned different tools of the trade along the way, and really never lost interest in the magic that comes from a camera and a great idea. So when I was completing my dissertation on how immersive technologies were being used in museums, cultural heritage, and artistic contexts, I was really interested in how spatial capture was becoming increasingly used both to document, but also to engage audiences. And some examples that really stood out for me were Dust by Maria Judova and Andrzej Wosławski, I believe is how you pronounce. I hope I'm not mispronouncing. And this project was from around 2017, which it was a 4-minute long immersive virtual reality experience where you were placed in an immersive environment, or in the immersive environment of a dancer within this unique visual and oral scenario, created by capturing volumetric recordings of both the dancer and a photometric imagery of this ramparts building, so this specific building. And you were kind of set in relationship to that volumetric capture while you were in the headset. So you were able to experience the work from multiple different perspectives in the space where the dance was happening. And then the Dimensions and Testimony project at USC, which created an interactive volumetric set of biographies with Holocaust survivors. This is still going on. It was started, I think the first interview started in 2014. But these are designed as conversational interactions with these eyewitnesses to history. So, and gives people the opportunity to learn from those who were there. And so that was obviously those two were very striking and part of the things that I was considering for my dissertation work. And then shortly after I completed the dissertation in 2019, of course, a new project comes out that's like perfectly in line with my research, which was the Dali Lives installation at the Salvador Dali Museum. This launched in 2020. And it employed AI to resurrect the Spanish surrealist Salvador Dali, who lived from 1904 to 1989. And it allows visitors to interact with this lifelike digital imitation of the artist on screens throughout the museum and learn about him, his life, and his artistic legacy. The creation team used archival footage, interviews, writings from the artist to train that AI model. But in addition, an actor with similar features was used to add realism to the performance. And I believe that was done with volumetric capture. And so as you're seeing in this video, right, you can get a sense of how lifelike that hologram is. So those were just a few things that inspired me and are what brings me to this kind of work. And so, I want for us today to kind of think about both these types of experiences, but then also to understand the work that goes into making these types of experiences and the actual hardware, software, things like that behind it, right? Because that's how we come to know these things and really are able to critique and analyze them. So let's get into it. Traditional video records what a lens sees. Volumetric capture records a space, allowing us to move through a recording as if it was a live environment. For researchers, this means moving away from the limitations of a flat screen into the world of spatial data. So traditional video is obviously a flat projection of light. Volumetric capture is the process of capturing a three-dimensional space or object in real time, resulting in a digital representation that can be viewed from any angle. The difference here, right, is moving from 2D to this 6 degrees of freedom, right? We talk about this a lot in XR, this DOF, where you can move up, down, left, right, forward and backward within the footage itself. And then there's also this temporal data element when we're talking about volumetric video capture, right? So unlike static 3D scans, volumetric video capture records motion over time, creating this like living digital asset. Does that all make sense? Any questions about that before we move forward? Okay, great. So in terms of the anatomy of the data, we will get into the weeds more in a bit, but usually you'll be converting and working with either point clouds or meshes. You will want to choose your data format based on the project needs. So for example, point clouds are better for spatial analysis and raw measurement. Texture meshes tend to be better for immersive UX and human interaction studies. So why use volumetric video capture for research? Why go into this? Why bother? Well, first and foremost, I would say spatial accuracy. We're dealing with spatial data, capturing microexpressions and precise body language that with this kind of technology is often better, or you get more data than you would with 2D video. For example, maybe you're looking to track how well somebody's range of motion is improving with physical therapy. You're obviously going to be able to measure that in more detail if you have a whole 3D scan of that movement, right? Reproducibility, replay, being able to replay a human's performance infinitely from any perspective to gather different data points. This could be extremely valuable. Perhaps you're filming a very intense fight choreography scene, and instead of having your actors perform it repeatedly so that you can capture it from, different angles, wide, medium, close up, you can have them do it once, and then you choose the shots in post-production in dialogue with an editor, right? So you can see why Hollywood industry is interested in this type of capture for certain really high-end filmmaking, where maybe they're already using CGI, or they have a budget where they can only do this particular thing at a particular moment, and so they want to make sure that they're getting as much data information as they can. And then I would say ecological validity is another point here. Provide subjects with a highly realistic stimuli in VR and AR environments. This is maybe ecological isn't the right word, but essentially thinking of how people, or testing how people react to things. So perhaps you're doing a psychology study around facing fears, and participants who are afraid of horses could complete exposure therapy within VR with a lifelike volumetric video of horses around them. And this is going to cut back on risks such as the horses getting spooked by a participant's reaction, or a participant getting injured from a very large animal, right, that they're afraid of. We'll talk about some other case studies in a little more depth later, but you can get a sense of the possibilities from what I just described. Okay, so now that we know what it is, let's talk about kind of the heavy lifting here, which is the technical stack. To create a volumetric recording, we have to solve a fundamental problem. How do we turn a flat image into a coordinate. So to capture volume, we need more than just color. We need distance data. And most research setups use depth sensors like the Azure Connect. You can see this is one of those models here. You can also see it up in the upper right-hand corner of my camera view, and we'll be using that one later in a demo. But they're very powerful depth sensors, but they're quite lightweight, right? And these cameras don't just see color, they shoot out a field of infrared light that bounces off the subject to calculate distance. And you're seeing the specs here of that particular model on the right. There is a microphone that's part of this particular model. Some of the other ones that I'll talk about later don't have sound included. So again, in assessing what kind of technology, what kind of hardware you're going to employ, you'll want to look out for things like that, right? There's also passive stereo. So you can use multiple RGB cameras to calculate depth via parallax. This is similar to the human eye. And the improvements here are happening quite rapidly, as we see with a lot of technology today. This picture above is me standing in the middle of Google's volumetric capture array back in 2019. There's a lot of cameras. And what you can see, I'm holding a kind of mirrored ball, so you can see the other side of this spherical setup. And you can see there's a little door right here where you can enter into the space, but everything else is essentially a camera that is all meant to shoot simultaneously to capture and create a volumetric 3D model. The picture or the video that you're seeing below shows Canon's small format system, and ASU is deploying this new prototype for volumetric capture, and I think it uses only about 20 cameras, and they're actually iPhones, and it's synchronized imaging combined with Gaussian splatting to transform live human motion into 3D video, enabling research to or into new workflows, right? So obviously a much smaller setup allows us to be much more nimble. You're dealing with less sort of data capture. And so obviously it cuts down on a lot. And again, we'll talk about some of the challenges later, but it's incredible to see what they're achieving with less now. And researchers are focusing on reducing the number of cameras needed. So at USC, they're developing techniques that use only a single standard camera, so monocular approaches to achieve real-time, high-fidelity volumetric performance. That's what you're seeing here on the left. This is from a 2020 study, and they're still coming out with new updates to this. I think the last one was in 2025. And I should mention all of the things that I'm showing on these slides, and in addition to citations and things, are all mentioned in my the notes of my presentation, and I'm happy to share that out so that you all have access and can take a look for yourself. And I did want to bring our attention to or mention that DeepMind recently introduced this D4RT or DeFort. I don't know what it looks like DART to me, but D4RT, it's an AI model that unifies dynamic scene reconstruction and tracking into a single efficient framework for better, faster, quote unquote, 4D, so 3D plus time, volumetric video. So D4RT stands for Dynamic 4D Reconstruction and Tracking. It utilizes a unified transformer architecture to jointly infer depth, spatial temporal correspondence, and a full camera parameters from a single video. So essentially you have a video, right? And then it's able to infer the sort of volume of the thing that you're looking at, or the thing in focus within the video, as you're seeing here, right? So what we're starting to see is, rather than replacing hardware or just focusing on updating hardware, AI is now being used to compress data, fill gaps between camera views, and enable real-time streaming, right? So AI is upping the game here significantly. And I also want to mention LiDAR. So it's not quite volumetric capture, but I think it's an important part of the conversation, and often related in terms of research. So pulse-based laser scanning for high precision environmental mapping. This is more motion capture than volumetric capture. But for example, companies like Movin are delivering real-time markerless motion capture using a single device powered by LiDAR and AI. So a setup like this takes just minutes. You're just kind of plugging in your LiDAR camera, setting up the space that you're going to be using, and it's a point and shoot kind of translation. This can allow for more lifelike movements of avatars within immersive spaces, right? People are using this to kind of have interactive avatar scenes play out. But it could also be used to document choreography or analyze the different performance of the same choreography, right, by different dancers. There's a lot of different applications that you might envision for technology like this. And a typical volumetric capture pipeline looks something like this. It's really pared down, obviously, but it's going to be, you're going to go through some form of these things. Calibration and sync, right? Aligning all the cameras to a single coordinate system, and ensuring that they trigger at the exact same millisecond, because if they don't, you're going to get a kind of jiggering output that just doesn't feel realistic, right? That feels messy, that doesn't feel synchronized. So we obviously want to avoid that. Capturing a background or capture and then background subtraction. So obviously isolating the subject from the noise of the room or the environment in which the capture was taken. When I do my demo in a second, you'll see there's some of that can happen in the actual capture software, and then some of this will likely happen in post-production or additionally in post-production. Part of this may happen in this reconstruction phase, right, where you're fusing the multiple camera views into a single 3D representation. This is often when you're dealing with noisy data, or lining things up that maybe weren't originally aligned right, or dealing with holes in your data, right? Again, these are some of the challenges we'll mention again later on. And then there's the compression and encoding. So converting your raw 3D data from the capture tools formats into playable formats, or formats that are digestible for the environments in which you're going to actually view these things or experience these things. So game engines, various game engines, Unity, Unreal, WebXR. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay. Before I get into the demo, I just want to mention, here's an example of my hardware array that I set up for this demo. And this is just to give a sense of how this all works together. It's simplified. I'm only using one Azure Connect in this instance, so you're not going to get a full experience, but you'll start to see the depth and how this will all work together. But for this hardware array, I would recommend, I'm using a smaller monitor here so that I can operate, but typically I use a 4 or 5K widescreen display because you'll need to be able to move the capture area around while maintaining a full view, right? The more area that you have to do that in, the better. I'm using an Intel i7 7th generation, at least minimum you need that, with 16 gigabytes of RAM, with external solid state drive, and 1 terabyte, because doing this kind of work, it's just, you're dealing with a data eater, right? There's just a massive amount of data that's going to be generated. And you'll see that in just a second during the demo with how big these files are. Microsoft Azure Connect DK, as I mentioned, is what I'm using. And I'm using the free Depth Kit software, which only supports a single camera and 30 seconds worth of recording. So it's very limited. It's obviously allowing you to get a sense of what their product is. The company was bought by EverCoast. I'm going to mention EverCoast, some examples from EverCoast later on today. But Depth Kit is now owned by EverCoast. And if you are interested in live streaming, they have live streaming volumetric capture. They have a number of tutorials on how you can do that, with a webcam. You do need their software license in order to do it, which is, I believe, about $3,000 a month, if I'm not mistaken. It's expensive, right? So there are open source options I'll be mentioning in a minute, not necessarily for live streaming, but for volumetric capture. But typically, it runs the gamut really for the kind of softwares and the pricing around these softwares. But I do have links and tutorials to more in-depth tutorials than what I can cover here today, to Depth Kit if you're interested. And finally, most importantly, I'm using a 3060 RTX GPU. Again, this is a minimum for doing this kind of work. You really need that additional processing power for this to work. Okay, I'm going to, I think Lauren has pinned my second screen. I'm going to stop sharing on my first screen. I'm going to keep my mic on my first screen, and have my sound disconnected on my other screen, but hopefully you'll be able to see everything. So let's try this out, and you all let me know if something goes terribly awry. Okay, so we've disconnected there. And I'm going to share over here. Can you see that screen?
Yes, it did come up.
Great. Okay. So this is what you'll see when you download a Depth Kit and you open a new project. You're going to have a view panel, right? And you see that here, and it's going to give you a variety of previews. Obviously, this is the main color preview here. And this is an environment in which you can start to move. It's a 3D environment, right? So you can see what your camera sees, right? What your volumetric capture device sees. You can see the depth preview as well. And then you have some other preview streams up here that you can adjust. So for example, this will switch you to the point cloud view, which doesn't seem like a point cloud initially until you start to zoom in a little bit more, and then you can see, yes, point cloud, got it, right? If I zoom back out, switch back over, we're in a mesh view here. So that's what you're seeing typically when you first open. You've also got a texture surface view, which is turned on automatically, but you could switch to the shaded surface, right? And again, switching back and forth there, you're going to get a different sense of what you're capturing, what kind of data. You can just show surface normals, and you can toggle on and off the wireframe as needed. And again, you would likely be playing around with that when you have multiple cameras, right? Multiple sensors, depth sensors connected, and you want to make sure that you don't have any holes in your capture. And so what I'm just going to point out over here is your sensor configuration. That's where this work happens. Am I slowing down? Can you still see me? Okay, good. It looks like I've slowed down on my side, but it's probably just my Zoom. Okay. So here's where you will, once you plug in your sensor, you will see, you can select, right? So it showed up for me here. The Azure Connect, if you're operating off of Windows, it will automatically recognize. You shouldn't have to download their SDK. If you're using a different device, I'll talk about that more in a minute, but you may have to download their SDK in order for it to plug and play, but then you should be able to see and select the multiple devices here. You'll also be able to set up the stream configuration. So exactly how high-end, what quality you want to get out of this particular device, right? I can go up to 1080p and get a little bit better resolution here if I want to. Can also adjust, right, ratio depending on the output that I'm looking to do. And you can start to see that shift over here. The other thing that I'll mention is the depth mode that you select is important. So if you can see, right, if I go wide, you can see much more of my setting now, right? But you might not get the same quality, same detailing as if you went in with a more narrow view, right? And there's wide raw. Again, that's going to be, you can start to see the difference there, right? Now, just like typical cameras, you're able to set the video settings, play around with things like brightness, contrast, saturation, sharpness, and you know, all of that will be based on what the goals of your capture are, right? Finally, in advanced settings, you can adjust the power line frequency. Most of the time you won't need this, but again, depending on how many you're hooking up to and what the power that you're drawing is, you may adjust to 50 hertz, but for the most part, you're going to be using 60 hertz. Once you record, you will have a recording library file that shows up here where whatever place you've selected for your recordings to go on your computer. And I'll show that in just a second when we hit record. So before I hit record, I do want to point out one thing. Obviously, you can name your recording here, but you can preview your depth range. So what does this mean? Well, let's take a look. I can adjust on the fly here what is getting captured and what isn't getting captured. So say I don't want the background. Say I just want myself. I can cut out that. Now, why would I go ahead and do that at this level? Well, again, it's all about the storage space, the amount of data that you're capturing, right? So in this case, I've just shortened the depth frame so I don't have to capture all that other data. which means that data doesn't get stored, right? Which means I'm not using that much compute. And again, you can adjust that from either side. So I could, if I don't want myself as part of this, you could just capture my background. Looks a little awkward, but there you go. So that's why you might adjust that depth range, is to avoid the extra data capture. Now, here's why. I'm going to just record for a second here. Recording. Okay. Now I'm stopping. So once I've recorded, that's going to show up in my recording library. You'll see that file right here. And if I right click and look at the properties, that like just a couple of second clip is 41 megabytes, right? That's a lot of data for just about, 2 seconds worth of footage. So already you can start to do the math. If you have multiple depth sensors running simultaneously and you're capturing all at the same time, imagine what that file is going to look like, how big that file is going to be. It's going to be fairly massive. And the final thing I want to point out in this software is this editor section. So you can preview what you've captured, right? That's me waving. So that was 41 megabytes for 3 seconds of footage. You can play around with this a little bit, right? You have some refinement options here where you can filter your size, you can filter your sharpness, that color contrast, right? Similarly to an editor software. You can adjust that depth range in the aftermath. So I can take out that here, again, cutting back before export, right? So I did that raw capture, but I'm obviously, this is not the export that I'm going to use when I bring it into another environment. That's going to happen here. So this is where I can select the type of export beyond the raw capture, which you saw in the folder, right? And this is where I can start to think about, do I want the texture geometry? Do I want all the kind of additional things added? And then I can think about the settings of like, is this going into a MetaQuest? Is this going into Apple Vision Pro? Do I want to customize it, right? These are the presets here that you can select from, at least within DepthKit, or this version of DepthKit, to be able to export for a particular type of platform, right? And again, you have some advanced settings to play with, and then you can export. In our tutorial today, because already I'm running up against time, I'm always running up against time when I do these things, it will go for 2 hours. So we will hopefully get into how to take an export of a video like this and bring it into another environment, maybe like Unity, so you can see that whole process. But you get a sense of what that capture looks like, what that final file size is going to be, and then you bring that into your playable environment. So I'm going to stop share there and move back to my slides. Oh, actually, one final thing. This is why I always have my notes for demos to make sure I don't forget things. So I did want to show, once you've recorded, you can delete. Law of demos. Okay, so in your recording library, say you did a capture like, oh no, that's not the capture. your recording library is going to show them, one after another here, and you can just simply, you can edit the title or you can delete it. And when you delete it, it's going to remove it and all associated media. So just make sure that you're ready for that to happen. And so that's how you clear that. Okay. Any questions there? Yeah, thank you for that, Andre. Yes, my nerves of normally I can everything for that very reason. So thank you. I'm glad. I hope that went okay in terms of how it looks on your side.
Yeah, everything worked out good. Lisa also has her
Oh,
hand
Lisa,
raised.
question. Yes, Lisa.
I'm just curious. I mean, you've talked about how huge these files are.
Mm-hmm.
What's the largest file size and length of that clip that you've actually been able to manipulate and work with relatively easily?
Ooh, I mean, well, DepthKit, this free version of DepthKit, the most that I can record is only 30 seconds. So I haven't done the full 30 seconds. I haven't even attempted to try that. But I will do that for the workshop next week and report back. I imagine if we're thinking it was 41 megabytes for 3 seconds. I mean, I'm gonna round down and say like 10 megabytes for every second. So 30 seconds. Was that 3,000 megabytes? Am I doing that right? Doing that math right? So it's big.
Where do you think on the typical computer, the computer is just going to say no?
Um, it depends on your system. This is why having solid state hard drives, I have 1 terabyte, of storage ready to go. Like a 5090 will handle at least 30 seconds, but it's most average systems are not going to be able to do this. You're going to need a gaming system or something that has graphics cards that can handle this kind of thing.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, good question. And definitely I'll include more information on that in the workshop next week. Because I think that those types of knowing the limits is an important part of doing this kind of work. So this is from Mod Tech Labs, an article that was done in 2020, which is a little outdated at this point, but not too far gone. And most of these things I think are practical and still hold true. So these are just tips and tricks for volumetric capture. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I think this is pretty standard for most 3D capture. But obviously, there are specific things to keep in mind to set yourself up for good results, or at least to be aware of, or make sure that you're aware of, that will be challenging going in. So if you happen to shoot with something that has a shiny surface or is a very thin object, right? Obviously, those are things that you're going to want to keep in mind going in. Somebody has a hat, right? In a capture that you're doing, that brim might not look great. So keep that in mind. There's a real spectrum of modalities and tools when doing this work. Professional studios use high-end rigs, and I'm going to show a sample of that in my next slide. But we're seeing a lot of mobile and consumer solutions that are still pretty great. I'm thinking like LiDAR enabled iPads or iPhones, mobile phones can do rapid field research now. Like I'm imagining my colleague, Dr. Shamel Bell, and her street dance activism events, and like being able to use a capture like that to look at the choreography coordination across public participants, right? That could be an example of a project that could be done. And these things are getting, as I said, lighter and lighter. weight. The software ecosystem, though, is complicated. Obviously, I've mentioned DepthKit owned by Evercoast. There are open source options. So LiveScan 3D and volumetric capture are two that are regularly recommended. And then there's the processing and display portion. So again, I'm not getting into it in this presentation, but I'm hoping to talk about that more in my presentation next week with things like Unity, Unreal, right? That's where these assets are going, and that's where a public will experience them typically. So when you're doing this kind of work, quality and budgetary considerations are obviously essential. The Azure Connect that I've demoed, this retails for about $1,000. And again, you do get sound with that. Another option that I tried in preparation for today was the Microsoft Xbox One Connect sensor bar. A lot of people initially, when they realized they could hack these things and use a Connect PC adapter, they were like, fantastic, and started using that. This doesn't have sound when you do that. And the quality is much lower. It still gets you, you can still do that kind of full volumetric capture. You can still get a 3D model. It's just not going to be as precise. It's not going to be as clear. So again, it depends on the output that you're going for. But I will say the price of these, you can get one of these from like anywhere from $50 to $100. And then like a $24 adapter. So cost-wise, again, depends on what you're looking to do. If you have to get 6 or 7 of these or more to get the kind of quality that you're looking for versus 6 or 7 of those, you do the math, right? Now, on the high end of things, I did want to showcase kind of what that looks like. And price range, what does that look like? So Evercoast recently conducted a technical validation project to explore using 36 red Komodo cameras for high fidelity volumetric capture. The project aimed to produce photorealistic 4D human performance captures suitable for high-end markets. So things like film, visual effects, right? VMX, XR, VR, and interactive gaming. The project compared 2 hardware arrays. So the RealSense D455s, and these retail for about $400. And it's a depth camera. So as you can see, they're light. They're even smaller than the Azure. And you can sync those up. And then there's the red Komodo, which is a cinema level camera. I mean, people shoot movies with those. I think they used red cameras. They use red cameras at USC in the film school. So the difference is 400 versus a red camera retails for about 4,000. So there's a 10 times difference there, right? The cinema cameras are 10 times more expensive. So the test was designed to determine if the superior performance in image quality, to test the image quality of dynamic range and reconstruction stability justified the additional hardware cost for high-end markets like film and VFX. And the evaluation aimed to clarify like how much better the red cameras performed. And you can see here, right? So this is what the workflow looked like. This is the side-by-side comparison. This is the red camera. You can, the capture from the red camera, you can see the logo very, very clearly. Here's the RealSense. Still very, it's a good capture, but you can't see Adidas. The RealSense, right, still very realistic in terms of, a person holding a baby, but here it feels like they're real. So the fidelity, obviously much higher. Precision synchronization, the test validated that the cameras could maintain a perfect frame alignment during high motion captures, so that was good. And then unlike systems that rely on depth sensors, the red array relied solely on monocular image data, and despite lacking dedicated depth sensors, the Evercoast Gaussian splatting pipeline produced cleaner and more stable volumetric reconstruction. So again, depending on the project and the needs of the project, that cost may be considered worthwhile. Now, before we wrap up, I want to share a few interesting use cases and then just highlight some of the pitfalls here. The project Preserving BIPOC Expatriates Memories During Wartime and Beyond was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I got to listen to this presentation at the H2 conference at USC in 2024. This project explores the use of volumetric video capture to document and preserve the stories of lesser known historical figures, such as World War II veterans, particularly BIPOC World War II veterans. And the initiative brings together performance studies, digital humanities, and archival science to create immersive experiences that enliven traditional archives. And you could see the presenters there, Zach and Rashida, and Brian Carter is over at ASU and does all the rigging and things for this kind of capture. So I just want to point out a few things that I think are unique challenges that they discussed in their presentation of this project. Data management and archiving, first and foremost, extreme file sizes posed a significant storage and sustainability question for this team. Archivists must decide whether to keep the massive raw files for future higher resolution systems or rely on compressed derivatives like MP4s, which require sidecar files to maintain their 3D relationships, right? When you're doing this kind of work, what do you choose to save? What's necessary? How are you thinking about forward migration, right? All of these kinds of questions get so much harder when you're looking at massive file sizes. There's also physical limitations that they discuss. So high fidelity capture often requires participants to stand still for several minutes, which was difficult for their elderly interlocutors. World War II veterans that were being interviewed. That was hard for them. So just kind of practical things around the participants. And then finally, proprietary software, obviously dependence on private platforms like Formavision. VoluCap was a partner in this project with them to do a lot of the processing. It really creates this sort of black box preservation risk. If companies go out of business without providing documentation on their file structures, again, that forward migration issue comes back up. Also, ethical and educational impacts. Student engagement, they saw their students loved it. Students reported that interacting with the volumetric figure felt like, quote, having a conversation with my granddad. I mean, like that's the kind of feedback they're getting, which is incredible, right? So obviously there's a deeper physical and visceral connection with history that's happening when we do this kind of work. Obviously, that's very motivating. But then there's ethical considerations because volumetric video captures of, it captures a person's biometric form. And that raises complex consent issues regarding potential of AI-driven misuse, such as deepfakes. And then there's sort of agency and care questions in terms of the intensive rehearsal process required by the technology's time limits, often 3 to 4 minutes per take. That's as much as they could kind of squeeze out of their hardware array. And this led to a tighter, more collaborative relationship between the interviewer and the subject, right? They had to make sure that these World War II veterans that they were interviewing were telling their story in 3 to 4 minutes, being really efficient about it. And so obviously, in terms of the ethics of care and in terms of how we don't want to be influential around how people tell their stories, we want for oral history, right, people to speak in their own voice. There's an ethical question there, right? A kind of interpretive question there. And just to wrap up, there's a couple of really interesting medical case studies that this is coming out of Evercoast collaborations that I just want to direct you to. There's a page here that you can go and take a look at these. But essentially, Johns Hopkins has created an extended reality learning hub for MetaQuest headsets to prepare for clinical readiness, or to train people around clinical readiness. So it allows students to observe emotional nuance, such as patient's hesitation, or things like a reassuring gesture, right? So again, training around dealing with real humans, or seeing how that interaction plays out, and doing that role playing in a way that's kind of lower risk, high reward. Same thing with Providence immersives, e-learning for soft skills. They're directly integrating this into their learning management software, and this doesn't require a headset, but the 3D clips obviously allow for students to study body language and posture and facial expression, and hopefully improving their communication and empathy in patient care. And then true motion technology being used in hinge health. So again, this kind of ability to look at people's precise biomechanics, joint angles, and things like that when doing specific movements. I think I've covered most of these challenges and complaints or constraints already, but obviously the data heaviness, things like lighting and occlusion difficulty there. There's always the blind spot issue when dealing with these arrays. Cleanup takes time, and obviously the ethics of a digital double are not, these are heavy questions. Hopefully that we can have more of a discussion on or next week about, if you join my workshop then. I of course have run out of time, but if you do have questions, I'm happy to stay on. But thank you all. And I do have like these RealSense step capture devices. I would love to work on a project if anybody is interested in collaborating, using these things out in the wild, and getting some real samples of how we might use them to do research. So if you're interested, let me know. And thank you all so much.
Well, thank you. Andrew does have a question in the chat regarding the technology for motion in 2015. He was wondering if it was the same as he used at the USC Institute.
Let's see.
Yeah, and sorry, it was like a long-winded comment, barely a question, but yeah, it just that so they had the big spheres of cameras, but we only got like static 3D files, like 3D models out of it. So I wonder if the processing wasn't there yet 10 years ago to capture video.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, those rigs at that time, what I was seeing is like all the things were going off, and then it was being used, like all the simultaneous caption would happen. We were able to render single 3D model, but not video, because that obviously requires so much more data capture. And also just what we can do now with AI and processing these kinds of things when it comes to video. It's transformed it. So yeah, that's my recollection as well. As back then we could really only do static, and now we can do more. But I think Canon early on, the first video that I was showing was like some of those things were happening late 20, maybe 2020, where we were starting to see being more used in sports, right? In arenas and things like that. But yeah, it's was mostly for high-end things.
Yeah, and thank you for kind of illustrating, I guess, like the spectrum of these things, because I wasn't quite aware of I guess the high end and current, like the high fidelity approach to this, and like, all the data and everything. I threw on in the chat like a very low fidelity, low processing power example, and that was just a basic webcam face tracker that was useful when you can't take your hands off of a control, but you want to move your head around so the camera swings in like a game or a simulator or whatever. So
Yeah.
that was related, not the same thing, but as far as like, yeah, like the applications for this sort of thing, like, yeah, whether you're just controlling something or creating art or, like generating new stuff, it's it's interesting, and it was hard for me to kind of grasp what categories these things were. So anyway, thank you for clearing that up for me today. So appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Thank you. Great points and questions. I did include in the notes of the slides. There's like, I came across in researching and preparing for this talk, a lot of things happening in biomechanics. And actually, a colleague of ours in Data X is more of an expert in that area. So I would direct you to Jacqueline for that. But she, gait, like what, looking at people's gait, right? Looking at how people are recovering from through physical therapy, looking at this not just for humans, but for animals as well. Like there's so much that's happening in that area that I didn't even realize when it comes to motion and volumetric capture, and using this data to analyze improvement in health.
This is terrific. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and demo. And excited for your presentation next week at the OARC workshop.
Yeah, thank you all for having me, and thank you for helping me prepare for that too.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.